Next up, we have a panel session which will be moderated by Calista, who is Head of Tech and Digital at Lowston Communications. If you'd like to come up. I'm going to give you this
Thank you, great. So I will start off with a brief introduction of myself. I'm from Pennsylvania, so I was happy to hear the shout out in Jamie's speech, although we did better in the midterms. So at least I have something to be proud of. I have a background in political campaigning, which is one of the reasons why I'm up here today, a small role on the Obama re-election campaign. I've ended up in the UK. I specialize in tech policy and digital strategy. So I am a consultant, also kind of got a shout out, but not for Cambridge Analytica at least. And I'm pleased to introduce my panel. I'm going to start off with Areeq, who you work for WebRoots Democracy. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do there?
Yeah, so WebRoots Democracy is a think tank focused on technology and democracy, and so I started this in 2014, and two areas in particular we focus on are the potential of remote online voting in elections, and another area is regulating social media platforms, and in particular the objective of that part of research is to basically design very radical proposals for regulation and to try and start a conversation in that sense.
Thanks. Sabina is another speaker. She's a policy advisor at the European Parliament, and I understand you're also doing a PhD at the same time on an area related to the digital economy. What's that about?
Yes, hi. So I'm Sabina. Indeed, I've been working in the European Parliament for the last 8+ years. So through 2 mandates, third one coming up next year. And I do a PhD in King's College London on artificial intelligence and US foreign policy decision making.
Very interesting. And lastly, we have Kajal, who is the UK director of change.org. I'm particularly interested in knowing what you're most excited about that's happening on the Change platform right now.
We're a petition platform, and we've got 17 million users in the UK, which is 1 in 4 of the population, and we're open. So we're an open platform, so regardless of your political beliefs, you can start petitions on there. So we see stuff on either side of the spectrum. And I've just come from an event in Parliament about Brexit, where I was talking about the fact that, we're hammered by Brexit every single day. I can't move without hearing something about Brexit, but nobody's really asking the public about what they want with this deal. So we've been asked a really very kind of abstract top-line question, which is, do you want to leave or remain? But actually, the real policies that are going to affect our lives, no one's asking the public. So we've seen some incredible mobilization and people using our platform to demand to be heard. And so we've got a petition at the moment, which is the biggest petition we've had on our platform this year in the UK, calling for a final say, a vote on the final deal. And it's got over 1 million signatures. And I'm seeing the tide turning on this demand for the public to be heard around Brexit. So that's pretty exciting.
Thanks. So our panel is centered on politics being hacked. So if we can throw it out with a little bit of discussion from the panel about defining the issue. So what is actually happening? Areeq, if I can start with you from your research, how are our politics being hacked? What's going on?
Yeah, so I'll say, so one thing I really do is advocate for the introduction of online voting, and it's possibly the worst time to do so when you look at what's happening in America and elsewhere across Western democracies, where you're seeing states essentially using the internet and trying to interfere with elections in other countries discreetly, not always successfully. Like Jamie was saying, a lot of these things don't necessarily have much impact on any election, but it's the fact that they're trying and looking ahead in 20 years, what will that actually look like? Will it actually become quite successful? Will we actually have presidents elected because of interference by Russia, or referendums in this country swung because of the actions of people in other countries? In particular with America, because that's, I think, where a lot of this conversation is actually centered around, less so here in the UK. You have the issue there with electronic voting machines. So unlike in this country where we have paper-based elections pretty much throughout the whole of the UK, apart from Scotland where they have some e-counting. In America, different states have different systems, but you basically, you have software there or hardware that's contracts have been signed for about 10 years ago and are quite vulnerable. And therefore, there's quite a risk and a lot of conversation around whether you're going to see foreign states intervening with those. But the other main issue, I think, is that because the internet is quite a black box, and technology generally is quite a black box, even accusations of interference can undermine trust in democracy and can make it very easy to make accusations that elections are being tampered with. And one example I always use is if you look at the Brexit referendum and say it went the other way, 52-48 for Remain, and let's say this election was done online, all it would take is Nigel Farage to make an accusation, say it was hacked, for people to then distrust the results. And because the margin is so small, it kind of puts every vote into question. So, and I guess with what the fourth group's doing as well, if you want to create this global democratic institution, you're going to have to look at things like online voting, because if you look at things like what you're going to do, make an embassy in every country, that's going to be very inefficient and completely undoable. You're going to have to think about these issues now, because in the future, say it becomes a very successful organization, institution, people are going to want to start interfering with it.
No, I'll completely support your call for online voting. As an American citizen, it's an extremely archaic process to vote from overseas, and where I'm from is a very, very small town, so we have a joke that dead people still vote there. So this issue of elections being hacked is, maybe there's a bigger issue now, but it's not a new problem, it's just a different problem. We can fix that with cybersecurity, we can fix that with other things, but I appreciate the trust in the system actually being the key thing there. Sabina, sort of looking into the future then about the issues that we're likely to face in the coming years, what about the European elections that are coming up?
So yeah, I think a lot of the stuff that Jamie mentioned and Areeq here will kind of play out next year in May when we have the European Parliament elections, fortunately without Britain at that point. We've luckily had enough time since the US election and since the Brexit referendum to kind of try to figure out a bit of what's going on around fake news and how to protect elections, in terms of cybersecurity, but also the GDPR has come into force. So it's a lot of different measures that have been put in place to try to protect the upcoming elections. Of course, this is not the responsibility of the EU. It's each member state is organizing elections on their own. So it will very much vary in terms of implementation from east to west, from north to south in the EU, as it always does. So we may see different levels of implementation of EU regulation by mid next year. What I'd like to touch upon is something that Areeq mentioned in terms of this Russian interference or foreign interference in elections actually having an impact or not. And I'd like to share a story that's very recent, that was published by the EU Disinfo Lab, which is a body sponsored by the European Commission that's dealing with fake news for elections. And I hugely recommend it if you're interested in the topic. They have a really good up-to-date newsletter. And one of the recent stories is about Spain signing an agreement with Russia in exchange for Russia stopping all this Catalonia stuff going on in Spain. They would support them on the sanctions front in the EU Council, which is like completely Cold War stuff to me. So it's insane. So I think it does have an impact. I think it has more of an impact that we currently know. I think a lot of the stuff from 2016 is still to come out, still to figuring out what went on there. The micro-targeting in the Brexit referendum as well was completely crazy. I was looking at a case study specifically in Cambridgeshire where so there is a big Polish community in Peterborough, and they're targeting communities around at neighborhood level with fake news about Polish men robbing shops or whatever. You wouldn't necessarily make the connection of whether that's true or not, but you'd make the connection because you knew that's a Polish community. So, all that stuff going on, I think it does have an impact. I think beyond foreign interference and micro-targeting, it's also a kind of domestic problem. And of course, we have forces within our societies that are very happily using the tools to kind of swing the debates to the extremes. And one idea that I'd like to throw out there is, I live in Belgium, I work in Brussels, and Belgium is the only EU member state that has obligatory voting. They always have 90+% participation in all the votes, because otherwise you get a fine. So what happened there, the reasoning behind that when they implemented the system was to never allow extremes to get to power. Because when you have everyone voting, you can never have either the far left or the far right reaching government positions. And, well, at least from that point of view, I wouldn't praise the Belgian government for anything else, but at least from that point of view, it's kind of, it's working. So I think that's an interesting discussion to have, online voting, but also kind of maybe obligatory voting.
Yeah, mandatory online voting. So, Kajal, around that petition about Brexit, what is it that people are worried about? Are they concerned with the issues that we've brought up and that Jamie's brought up already here today?
Yeah, I would just take a step back for a second. So I think that, so Change.org is a tech company. Our head office is in Silicon Valley in San Francisco. And one of the things that is really striking to me is that these big tech companies like Facebook, they were never designed to be civic participation platforms. They were designed to be, helping friends to talk to each other. And that's, Mark Zuckerberg said he wanted to create a better world. But actually what ends up happening is that these companies all created better targeting. And so, and better ways of optimizing and trying to increase the chances of you using these platforms. And growth, so, speaking from Change.org as well, and just seeing the tech industry, growth is the #1 strategy for these organizations. And so when you're aiming for growth, you're trying to keep people addicted to the platform. And it leads to polarization, it leads to misinformation, and then it leads to corruption during elections. But just, I want to also make the point that this was never intended from these, as much as these Silicon Bros are, kind of annoying, I don't think that they ever set out to, they never expected these consequences. And actually, when you are building a platform for civic participation, you can tweak the algorithms and you can tweak the design to bring people together, not pull them apart. So some of the things that we've been doing and that that I think, that I think Facebook has actually started testing out is giving users the ability to kind of vote on content whether they trust it. So how much do you trust this third party? And so you kind of create these peer trust networks. And then, if something's flagged a lot, so one of the things that we do, so if something's flagged a lot for misinformation, we've got a tiny team in the UK, there's 6 of us, but then I will then liaise with our policy team to go, okay, is this factually correct or incorrect? We have to do the research. You can't just have robots doing this stuff because often there's so much nuance involved. And that's another thing. So, the solutions aren't as easy as just creating better AI. People have to be involved. But I would also just like to say that, and actually what Jamie was saying, I really massively agree that it's about us and it's about our, what do we want the future to look like? I was talking to my friend earlier who's at the back, and we were talking about the fact that it feels like with tech, it's very much like climate change was about 5-10 years ago. No one's really, the public, you can't motivate the public about it. And I don't know what it's going to take. It wasn't Cambridge Analytica, because as much as the media were hammering that story, but the public, Alvin started an incredible campaign on our site called Talk to Us Mark to try and pull Facebook to account and have them speak in front of Parliament. He's just like, no thanks. And, so our Parliament's just still sat there, but the public aren't going bananas for it. And so I don't know what it's going to take for people to really realise that this is serious and this is bigger than they think. Has anyone seen just recently their friends sharing this ridiculous Q currency? Like, so everyone thinks that there's like, if they sign up to this, it's like a pyramid scheme. So like, if they sign up to this thing called Q, that maybe they're going to make loads of money. And they're just willingly, they've got no idea who this company is, and they're willingly just giving their data. And then on the flip side of it, you know, the media is talking about how Facebook's taking your data and using it for whatever purposes. So, you know, people still don't get it. And I think, so there's a couple of things that I think need to happen. One is, like Jamie says, I think that the politicians need to be brought into the 21st century. It's so frustrating to me that the amount of MPs I speak to have got no idea what drives tech companies, how they make their money, anything about venture capitalism. They need to know this stuff. It's so important. And then the other thing I think is that we need digital literacy for the public. I think this stuff needs to be educated in school so that people really understand, because it's a reality and we're not going to go backwards now. It's only going to get, more and more extreme.
Yeah, and looking forward to solutions, then we'll stay on that. It sounds like I was going to ask what more agency people needed. What do they need to be empowered with to be able to make the change that we need to see, or demand that change from our regulators or the people who are making our laws? Is there something that people need, or is it more than education? How can we start to think about giving power back?
I think it's about education, because I think that most people don't understand any of the stuff that when we talk about tech and that people are talking about Cambridge Analytica and talking about targeting, people don't understand. And so I think that's about education. I think so. It starts with that. You've got kids coding in schools, but are we actually teaching them about protecting their data and actually what happens to their data? Maybe if we mobilize young people, that's where it's actually going to start. That's where we're going to actually see the knock-on impact.
Sabina, talking about how you start to change regulation and policy. Is it on the EU level? Is it on the member state level? Is it an international level? To be future-facing, where do we need to be?
I think the discussion pretty much ever since 2016 has moved to an international level. We've had discussions about election protection, election integrity with a bunch of stakeholders at all kinds of level, whether it's at national level, EU level, but also international level under the UN framework and so on. So it's even within NATO for that matter, because it is a matter of kind of protecting the elections when it comes to foreign interference specifically. So I think it is like any kind of debate on tech. I think it needs to happen at the highest possible level, and including the widest possible stakeholder range that you can get. Whether it's, you talk about all the range of NGOs working on these issues, but like the whole industry bringing together regulators. And I think, yeah, if you can bring it under the UN, which we'll never be able to, probably that would be the framework. But I think for the time being, you'll have to have the like-minded countries working together. And yeah, it will have to be a kind of Western-focused coalition of work on that, I think, yeah.
Can I just add to that? So I actually think that the EU are the potential heroes in all of this, and I think that they're the only ones really putting the tech companies to account. During the Brexit, the EU referendum, Steve Hilton, who's big in Silicon Valley, and he came back to the UK because he's former number 10 advisor to campaign aggressively for Brexit, because he knew that the EU were really the only the only body out there that were willing to put Silicon Valley, hold them to account. And I think as much as, Nick Clegg recently got hired by Facebook, and it was, lots of jokes are made about it, but I actually think that shows that Facebook is realizing, because, Nick Clegg is the biggest advocate of the EU, and he knows what he's talking about, and I think that they've brought him in for that reason. I think they're starting to take it seriously.
Definitely. Areeq, to go to you, what's our best chance to be able to catch up quickly? Because that's what we've been hearing over and over again.
Yeah, so I mentioned that we did this, we're doing a project on regulating social media, and our first report came out a few weeks ago, which was looking at online abuse in political debate. And the objective of our project is basically to put forward really radical ideas, and I consider myself to be like a sort of leftist interventionist person in a libertarian world, right? So the kind of, I agree with all of we need a global institution, and that is really where ultimately it does need to end up, as we need a similar sort of Paris-style climate change agreement for tech policy. But that could take decades, right? I mean, we're talking, even looking at the climate change one, Trump pulled out of that, and it's got lots of hiccups in that. Can we afford to wait that long, or is there stuff that we can do now? And we put forward 11 recommendations around online abuse. Some of them are kind of, I guess, less interesting. Things like mandatory transparency reports from social media platforms, the creation of a new regulator for tech companies. The most radical ones we had, however, were my favorite one, which was to implement a new tax on social media platforms, not based on revenue or profit, but based on the number of users that each of these companies has. So, for example, if you're Facebook, we call it the civil internet tax, if this rate was set at £1 and you have 30 million users in the UK, you pay £30 million a year. And it's very difficult to avoid that because you either do or don't have those number of users in the UK. And what you can then do is reinvest that money, which doesn't really exist, especially in a austerity Britain, into initiatives like digital literacy, into initiatives like anti-discrimination. And the most radical one we had in there, which we've received the most hate for, I would say, is an idea to implement as a final sanction on social media platforms a 3-day nationwide suspension of that platform. Super radical, but obviously lots of comparisons to like North Korea and China, which does overshadow the idea. However, they have elections in North Korea. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing just because the way that they do it is very messed up. And if you look at a normal company in the UK, so let's say you're a takeaway and you'd completely disregard health and safety standards, you don't have a blank check to continue operating. It's the same with any other company. If you fail to hand in your accounts at company's house, you can get shut down. However, when we look at the internet, we seem to step back and say, well, we can't go there. We have to give them a blank check to operate. We can only work around the edges and change things here and there. But really, I think we need to be a lot bolder and a lot more radical if you really have any sort of chance of reining in these kind of companies.
There's definitely a libertarian strain that comes from Silicon Valley. I do really like your idea for the revised tech tax. As a lot of us were probably aware, there was the tech tax floated in the budget for a ridiculously low sum of money than they should be able to raise from those kind of tech platforms. But now I'm going to throw it open to the audience. I'll take maybe a couple questions. If you can keep them, we're going to grab one of those. If you can keep them short, and a direct question would be preferable. So hands. And including for Jamie, I can try to get him to answer anything, right? Thank you.
Hello. Hi, my name is Alfie. I'm from the Common Sense Network. We provide news which tackles echo chamber culture by bringing different ideologies together in a constructive, structured way. My question was for Areeq on the topic that we were just discussing. I really like the innovative feature of this tech tax idea, but I just wanted to know what are the actual logistics of forcing something like that through, who has to agree, and how does Facebook agree? Thank you.
So the main issue with all of these kind of regulations, I would say, is how you define each company. So we didn't try to actually do this in our report, but how do you define a social media platform? Is it just Facebook and Twitter? Are there other ones? What else comes into that? Is Wikipedia a social media platform because people can talk to each other on there? So that's one big issue, I would say. In terms of how you'd actually do it, I mean, it relates to this transparency reports idea. I mean, like with any taxation or most taxation, you self-report figures. So if you're self-employed, you self-report your figures to HMRC. You could have a similar sort of thing where social media platforms self-report however many users they have in the UK. Often they actually publish these anyway in their advertising offerings, so it would be relatively easy to verify. And then the other problem is how do you then enforce the payment of that taxation if they don't do it? Again, this is kind of looking at those other options, like the most extreme one, which is the actual suspension of platforms, because you don't really have any levies to shut down platforms if they disregard the rules.
Great. Other questions? See one over there.
Hi, my name's Fumi Adebayo. I'm an opinion columnist for the Africa Report and also a trader and credit analyst. I guess it's two things which I've noticed as a common theme, but also in this panel discussion. As someone of African descent, I'm a bit wary of international organizations like the UN, IMF, World Bank, etc., for many reasons, because they tend to not take into account the cultural nuances of situations. What's right or wrong is a moral question, and that's usually informed by your cultural rearing. And there's always a lack of context around many of these things, and I think that's quite lacking. But secondly, I think that I don't think there's a problem necessarily with being able to persuade people about something. I mean, that's what politics is fundamentally about. The problem, sometimes it feels a bit, it doesn't feel very clear if the problem is if they're using lies, things that are just not facts, or if the problem is that they've been able to change or influence people's minds, because I don't think that the latter is necessarily a problem. So I just wanted some more clarity on that from the panel more generally.
Great, so this is a very much like fake news centered question, because we're talking about disinformation and misinformation and teasing those things apart from persuasion. And also the question, if who everyone's thinking about it, whoever wants to take it, is centered around international norms, that we haven't perhaps reached a stage where we have agreed on those things for tech policy and tech platforms. So how can then we go ahead and start regulating them? You've been put on the spot, yeah.
Okay, I'll say a couple of quick things about it. One of the things that wasn't reported either by us at the BBC or by the Observer is just how much Cambridge Analytica's original techniques were developed in developing world countries. I mean, Kenya, Nigeria, Caribbean, India, and there's a kind of a network of companies operating in those countries where the data restriction rules are much looser, and they're getting away with murder. And I don't know exactly, I mean, maybe we do need some kind of international data body that can really focus in on that, because when you look at some of the techniques, frankly, that were employed in those countries, they're way worse than anything that was done in the US. And I hope this is a story that in the next 6-12 months gets a bit more prominence, because it's pretty outrageous, and it hasn't really been talked about. It's like being tested there and then employed here, and anyway, it's a wider issue, but I suppose what I'm saying is that I accept your concerns totally about these international bodies, but you do have a group of international networked companies that are going around across these different countries doing this stuff with impunity. So we need to get on top of that somehow. I suppose I agree with you about persuasion. Obviously, politics is persuasion, and adverts have always been used, and TV has always been used, and politicians have always been liars and exaggerators and so on. I guess the problem is that it's being manifested in a different way now that is maybe slightly harder to see. I guess it's partly about how you address an age-old problem with these new technologies, rather than throwing up your hands and saying, we've always had this problem, we're always going to have it. Just because it was terrible before doesn't mean we can accept that it's terrible now and is always going to be terrible. I think the issue that I worry about is where persuasion starts to tip into manipulation so people are being targeted with things that they really don't even understand. I mean, it's about emotional triggers, personality types, certain neuroses. I mean, people who are suffering from depression getting targeted at the lowest point with a particular message to play on that weakness at that point in time. These are things that I don't think were possible at a kind of industrial level a decade ago, but that are now, which is why we do need, I think, to sort of new ways of trying to stay on top of it.
I think that the biggest lie that got us to leave was the £350 million that was on the bus, and it wasn't on social media. And I think that, there's one, there's one issue about the fact that should people be allowed to make claims in an election and then, not commit to not keep them. But I think for me, it's the bigger issue is the principle. And it's the fact that you've got, you had this bunch of very privileged people who set up these companies and didn't realize how big they were going to get. And they've permeated in our entire lives, and government should be holding them to account. They shouldn't get a free ride. They're in society. They are impacting our democracies, and so they should be regulated. And at the moment, they're not.
We'll take one more question. Let's see. Thanks.
Mike, also from the Common Sense Network. Just a quick question, mainly to the online platforms, I guess, on the stage. One thing we try and do essentially is kind of purport a holistic approach to solving issues. So for instance, one thing we're very big on is this notion of echo chambers and how we get people out of them. So our work begins online, but then also we do kind of live events to get kind of young people, namely millennials, interacting on ideas. And I just thought, to what degree you thought addressing these issues has to encompass a kind of live, human-centered kind of approach, or do you just think, so for instance, I have an issue or suspicion with kind of people retweeting and thinking that's campaigning, or people kind of tapping, like, and going, yes, support the movement. I'm just wondering, do you think a lot of these issues you're speaking about are going to be solved kind of solely online? And essentially, what part does kind of live action, mobilizing, galvanizing, that kind of stuff, what part does that play in kind of solving these social issues?
I saw 2 other hands, so let's quickly take those 2 other questions, and then we'll answer them in the round.
Hi, Andrea. I would like to ask Jamie for one question. I love what you said in the beginning about booths, going to the booths for the pictures and getting back. It's terrible, reflecting the politics. And last year, we were interviewing Jim Garrison, who was an advisor of Michael Gorbachev. And he said that the thing what the politics is lying this century is lying on disruptions. So I would like to say, what do you see? What will be 1 or 2 most disruptive things the politics or we as citizens will see in politics in maybe following years, based on your experience?
Okay, and over there.
So I was really interested by what the panel was saying about the influence that these groups have had on elections. My question is, if we know step 1 is that someone is interfering with our elections, and we know step 3 is we want to have fair elections, what's step 2? Do we rerun elections? What level of interference should we be doing something about? Once we've had an election and we know something has influenced it, what then? We don't seem to have policy implementation that says, we know that bad stuff happened online, so let's rehold it. Are we willing to bear that cost? At what level do we do it? This is something I'm particularly interested for the European elections.
Okay, so to recap really quickly, we had, I'm forgetting already. Yeah, the human factor, are the solutions all online, essentially, would be a good way of summing it up. The disturbances we're most likely to see, disruptions, that was directed to Jamie, and then what's our plan? So we get 350 million on the bus, and then what happens? What should happen? Yeah.
I'll start with your question. I really liked it because, you've probably all heard about Steve Bannon's new idea, new project for Europe. So he's created this far-right platform to basically counteract Soros and Open Society Foundation in Europe. And his idea is to go for the European elections. Nobody votes, perfect. We'll just rally our base and we'll get all these far-right people into the European Parliament. That's the plan. It may actually work. And it will work because of that. Because the social media is full of people actually supporting elections, confirming their voting, checking in 2 days before and then doing something else on vote day. So I think the bigger question there is grassroots kind of engagement and participation. And this is why I kind of brought up the idea of obligatory voting, actually, because as long as people stay at home when it matters, not much will change. So I think that's very important, taking all that enthusiasm and energy that you see, you see around any kind of elections, whether, national, in this case, European level, in the US, if you can translate all that enthusiasm and energy into actually get out the vote efforts on those important 4 days or whatever it is next year, I think that's where it will make a difference. And I'll touch upon the lady's question here. So yeah, there is step 1 and step 3, and step 2 is the biggest problem. The problem is we've been very reactive, mainly because we had no idea what's going on. So we had no idea what's going on with Russia until after the elections, after the US and after the Brexit referendum elections. Even now, we don't really know. I mean, yeah, we've heard about Sputnik News and Russia Today and a bit of the bot activity going on around there and how they, but the French elections were almost turned upside down 2 hours before closing, they have 24 hours before the election where you can't do campaigning, where you can't talk about it. And it was, I don't know if you've heard about it, this Macron leak story, which was going to come out an hour before. And that's the French elections coming up significantly after 2016. And Macron had a kind of fake news intervention team for that because he knew that's a problem. So I think the reasoning for that is us being reactive, right? Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, same thing. We kind of figured it out after it kind of happened, and then it's like, okay, what do we do about it? Let's bring Zuckerberg to kind of testify, kind of, in front of the European Parliament. He came. Well, we all know how that went. He went to Congress. We all know how that went. How do you regulate? Well, we do have a discussion on regulation, and Jamie mentioned that. It's how you actually, create that transparency and, all of that's kind of required now. So it's, you want to do ads in Europe, political ads, you have to say who's behind them, who's paying for them. Do they work? Well, not really, because only last week we've heard that 100 people from, there's this Vice report, 100 people just went on Facebook, said they are US senators, pushed through ads. So much for election integrity. So the solution is, I think, regulation to a certain extent. The solution is also awareness, and it's a mix of the two. It's, kind of politicians having more knowledge, more awareness, better prepared staff to actually work for them and do the kind of regulation that we need. You also need very aware and very engaged citizens that are able to flag those issues, that are able to have those conversations and push those into the kind of political arena as well.
Great, yeah.
Yeah, I'm wary of rerunning elections because you're unleashing demons that you really won't be able to control. But clearly regulation has got to be much more real-time in future. So I think we kind of put the others down to experience and figure out what we do from now. And I agree about the offline-online thing. I know that wasn't my question, but I totally agree. It's not all about online answers at all. Definitely not. In fact, most of the answers probably aren't to be found online. But one thing about echo chambers, I often think, I don't feel like we're stuck in echo chambers online. I feel like the problem is, certainly I feel this, is I'm surrounded by views I disagree with. But I just don't listen to them. I don't pay attention to them. I disregard them. I dismiss them. I impute malevolent motives to my opponents. And that's partly a kind of problem of how we engage with each other online. And partly I think that is, we live in an age of distraction where we're constantly checking our bloody devices for reasons you've said. The market, the bottom line demands it. And I think that makes us less capable of engaging with difficult, grey area, complex ideas, which is one reason why the 350 million claim, which I agree was not on social media, worked so well, because all of us can't concentrate anymore. The concentration level of the country's declined by about 50% in the last 10 years, which means we are persuadable by rubbish and nonsense. Whatever, yeah, exactly. Left wing, right wing, both sides are doing it. But the things that I think we'll really see, Donald Trump, in my mind, is the first social media politician who really understands the medium in the same way that John F. Kennedy was the first television president. But that won't be enough to wake us up. Snowden and Cambridge Analytica, like you say, hasn't been enough to wake us up. What makes government regulate things is when people die. And when the first either autonomous vehicle or smart home is hacked into and someone dies as a result of poor internet security or poor data use, there'll be an outcry and governments will regulate it. So unfortunately, I think it's actually going to take physical harm, deaths for governments to act, and sadly, that is going to happen in the next couple of years. Related to that, the big challenge everyone is sort of coming to mind now is the dramatic improvement in, if we think fake news is bad at the moment, the dramatic improvement in fake video content. And the reason I think that's really important is because video is an emotional medium. Visual mediums are emotional in a way that text is not. So you can have fake text news, and people can be duped, some people aren't. But videos, I think, play to a different part of our brains. And I think this is going to be a huge issue, which is why media literacy, I think someone already said it, is the most important thing you can learn in school, bar none. And it has to include psychology, because even Google's algorithms are not as powerful as our own cognitive biases, but we don't learn about that.
Thanks. I'll challenge you a little bit on the point about somebody needing to die, because people have already died based on fake news web stories. And I mean, in America, we don't regulate guns, and still taking there. So I wish there was more, or there was something else that would push it over the edge. But last question that I'm going to throw open to the panel, whoever wants to take it, is we've talked a lot about the negative influence of tech on politics. Does anyone have an example of a positive influence that tech has had on politics? And we'll end there.
Can I give a story? Because I do essentially we are using tech for good. So I want, and also just on the people dying, let this be you should learn about this stuff, talk to your friends and mobilize. That's the only way we can really get change to happen, when it actually comes from the bottom up. So feel angry and then talk to people, bang on about it. So it's not just the minority who just seem really paranoid about all of this. And it works. When you mobilize, you are consumers. And when consumers get together and push a company, they make changes. So I've just got a really quick story. So there's this girl called Belinda who's a uni student. Her mum uses a wheelchair, and her mum was visiting her in London for a weekend. And they were supposed to have this really lovely weekend traveling around London. Used Google Maps, and it just ended up being a horribly humiliating experience for the both of them, because every time they tried to get from A to B, they were sent on a route that just wasn't wheelchair friendly. So they'd get out of the station and they'd be met with a footbridge, and they'd have to go back. And I don't know if you know what it feels like to be a young person with your parent and your parent being humiliated. It's the worst feeling in the world. And so Belinda went home. So they spent hours just wasting time, and Belinda was really angry that this app wasn't designed for people like her mum. And so she started a petition calling for Google Maps to be wheelchair accessible. The reason it isn't is that Silicon Valley is not diverse, and so people making these products are just one type of person. So that's another thing that needs to change, that the more you get diversity in these making these platforms, they're actually then thinking about the risks of the things that they're creating, because some of the people who are building the platform are actually the people at risk. Anyway, Google ignored it, started getting thousands of signatures. New Statesman got really interested, started calling Google up for a response. Google ignored it. Then it got to about 200, 300,000 signatures, because Belinda told her story, and that resonated with people. And I think that's how you kind of get away from people becoming really polarized, and you get these abstract debates and people feeling really isolated from each other. But if you tell stories, you can bring people together. And then she started getting her signers to start leaving reviews on Google Maps, and just kind of just really piling on the pressure. And then Google eventually invited her in for a meeting. And now they're rolling out accessible maps in Paris, London, New York. And that's just the beginning. So I think, it is possible, and these companies, they listen to their consumers. So if you mobilize and you actually make them feel threatened, they'll start listening.
Great, thank you. Thanks to our panel. We'll turn over now. Thank you.